You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 5. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the podcast. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, my name is Paula Price, and I'm a lawyer turned certified executive coach. I'm really excited to be bringing this episode of the podcast to you because the podcast itself just went live last week. So this week has been delightful. I've been receiving some feedback and some comments and some lovely emails from friends, colleagues, clients, those of you who are listening to the podcast, and it's such a delight. It really is the realization of a dream coming true. And the reason that I wanted to chat about fear this week is because last week was, with the launch of the podcast, was this experience of equal parts excitement and fear. And the fear that I experienced felt real. And I wanted to talk about that fear while it was still fresh in my mind, because if you have experienced fear, and I imagine you have, I think all of us have, you may be able to relate to this. Sometimes it feels so powerful in the moment when you're doing something for the first time, when you're stretching yourself outside of your comfort zone. But then after a few days or a few weeks, the fear completely dissipates and you don't remember what it felt like. And I wanted to record this podcast while that feeling was still relatively fresh so that I could create something that would be more impactful for you and to create a resource that you can turn to next time you find yourself in one of those situations where you really are experiencing that fear. I think fear is an important topic to discuss, especially among women lawyers in general, because fear is not something that lawyers go around talking about very much. I think the law culture is very much one where you are in an advisory role. There's an expectation of confidence and know-how, and that you're the person who's going to help somebody else solve their problems. And in the professional work that you do, in the relationships that you have with colleagues and with clients, there's not really an opportunity necessarily for you to go and start talking about these things. And I think it's really important to recognize that even though you may not see it, other people may not be talking about it, the fear exists in everybody. And the question really is not whether or not you experience fear, but how you go about processing it. So that's really the focus of today's podcast. So if I go back to the experience that I had most recently, I just want to set it up a little bit because I think that though you may not be able to relate to the specific situation that I found myself in, you will very likely be able to relate to it in relation to something that you have on your plate or that you've had on your plate or a project that is ahead of you. So the interesting thing about fear is that in this case, it came up in a way that I had anticipated, but that I had not anticipated. When it came to launching this podcast, this is something that I have known that I wanted to do for some time. It has been on my to-do list for well over a year, and I absolutely planned for this to happen. I went and retained a coach. I've been working with an amazing company to help me produce this podcast, and I've invested a lot of my time, a lot of my resources in creating it. And the podcast itself is very much in alignment with some of the greater goals that I have for the coaching work that I'm doing, which are goals around making coaching more accessible to individuals by raising awareness about what coaching is all about and how it might be able to help you. It's about making coaching affordable, creating an offering that is available at no charge, and also creating a resource that you can access without revealing who you are. I think of it as the 4 A's: anonymous, accessible, awareness, and affordable. And so this very much fits in with what I'm trying to do for the people that I want to serve. That being said, when it was launch day, I found myself really stuck, and I was to promote the podcast. And there were a few things that I was going to do: post it onto LinkedIn, email it to individuals who are on the email list that I have. And I found myself in this bizarre state of true procrastination. And I don't know if you ever find yourself there. It doesn't happen to me very often, mainly because I have children, and I know that if I don't do things within a certain time frame, they don't get done. So when it comes to work stuff, typically I'm usually able to get it done, but I was literally frozen, and I started to have these crazy stories running through my head. I was making lunch and I started having all these very obscure thoughts, and I thought, this doesn't make any sense. This is exactly what I want to be doing. Why am I having such a hard time with it? And it brought me back oddly to the time when I was 18 years old, and a friend of mine and I decided to go to Mexico. And we decided for some reason, maybe because it was trendy at the time, that we would go bungee jumping. And so we signed up for these bungee jumping experience. We very smartly, so we thought, scheduled our bungee jumping session for the second to last day of our trip so that, if something went wrong, at least we would have had our wonderful week in Mexico. I can tell you, as a parent, looking back on that now, it just gives me the goosebumps. But when we got to that experience, it was very much an experience of facing a fear. And what's interesting about that, and what is relevant here, is that when you go bungee jumping, or maybe it's some other thrill-seeking adventure activity, what was weird about it was I remember going up onto this platform. It was this sort of metallic green platform that was suspended over the water, and I had the bungee harness wrapped around my ankles, and I was standing on the edge of it looking down at the water. And I knew that I had this bungee contraption attached to me, that I wasn't going to fall to my death, that I was going to fall and I was going to be caught, and this was all going to be just fine. So I knew at an intellectual level that everything was going to be okay. But every fiber of my being, as I sat there and tried to count myself down, 3, 2, 1, push off, it was so counterintuitive. It felt so unnatural. And weirdly, when it came to promoting the podcast last week, this is how I felt. I felt this fear. Like, even though at a logical level, I knew this was exactly what I had wanted, this is exactly what I had set up for myself, there was a part of me, a large part of me, that was just in resistance mode. I wanted to call the whole thing off. Didn't make any sense. So I just wanted to address this. I just wanted to talk about this in a way that puts this out on the table so that we can figure out how to deal with this. Because I imagine that this has happened to you. Maybe you've gone out there and you've got a goal and you've set up the goal and you've figured out all the details of how you're going to make it work. You've anticipated the hurdles. You know where you're going to get stuck. You've prepared for those hurdles and you're ready to go. And then you get there. And in the moment, it's like you're absolutely terrified and you start to try to talk yourself out of it. This is what I experienced. I'd taken all the steps. What was going on? Now, when I practiced as a lawyer, there were moments where I felt fear, especially at the beginning. And I know from having worked as a lawyer and spoken with my colleagues, I know now from being a coach for lawyers and speaking about lawyers about all sorts of things that they may not share with other individuals, that the fear is totally normal and that we're all experiencing it on some level. For some lawyers, there's a very strong fear of networking. For some lawyers, there's a fear of putting their name forward for new opportunities. Maybe you can relate to some of these things. Maybe you have a fear of going off the beaten track. I see that where lawyers have maybe been on a certain path and they feel like this is the right path for them, that it makes their families happy. It's what they thought they always wanted to do. And they're scared that if they go in a different direction, they're going to let people down. Maybe they're going to disappoint their clients. Maybe they're going to disappoint their colleagues. Maybe their bosses are going to be disappointed. It may be that you are afraid of making the wrong decision. And I see that a lot. decisions that maybe are work-related or decisions that are career-related. There's this idea that if you do one thing and it's not the right decision, it doesn't turn out to be what you wanted, then you've somehow failed. And that brings us to another example of fear, which is maybe the fear of failure, which really is what happens when you don't meet the expectations that you had set for yourself. So there's lots of places where fear can come up in a practice. And because nobody talks about it, you might experience it and then feel very much alone. I mean, imagine yourself in the course of your day. How often do we admit to fear? You can imagine sending a brief over to opposing counsel, and maybe they read it and they look at it and they think this is the most beautiful piece of written legal work I've ever seen. And these arguments are solid, and they're genuinely concerned about their client's position, having read the brief that you just submitted. But that's not what they're going to tell you. They're going to write back and they're going to say your argument is full of holes and your client's position is terrible and you know that we're going to win. That's how it plays out. And so it's not surprising that when you do find yourself in a situation where fear starts to come up, that you might think this is just not how it's meant to be, that there's something has gone wrong here. You're the only one. Another element of that is wanting to appear strong. And this was something that I remember experiencing as a lawyer quite often, is just wanting to always look like you're confident and you've got it all together. And sometimes you genuinely do have all those things together, but there's some times where you don't feel that confident, but you feel like you need to forge ahead anyways. And having a conversation with somebody doesn't seem like an option because you don't want to have to admit to a colleague or to admit to somebody that you're working with that maybe you don't feel 100% confident in what it is that you're taking on or what you're doing. So these are places where it comes up, and you may feel completely isolated, but I can assure you it's not just women lawyers. It's not just lawyers generally. It's really anybody who is taking a risk to do something that is important to them, that means stepping outside of their comfort zone and putting themselves in a position where they hold themselves out for judgment. And when you think about what you're truly scared of, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we get into it, you might be able to identify that there are some common themes. I know for myself, when I was putting this podcast out and I knew last week I was going to be promoting it, I was really scared of judgment. I was afraid of failing, whatever that looks like, however you define that. And so you might ask yourself, and we'll talk about this, what the fear is for you. So as I said, the reason I'm doing this podcast is that I just want to acknowledge that the fear is out there, and I want to talk about it so that you can understand it a bit better. And instead of feeling all the discomfort around fear, giving you some tools so that you can work with it. And today we're going to talk about fear, how it might show up in your practice, and I'm going to offer you 5 tools that you can use to help you next time you find yourself in that situation where you're procrastinating or you're not doing something because of fear. So before we jump into those 5 tips, I want to talk a little bit about fear and how it might show up for you. So today we're talking about the kind of fear that shows up when you're going after something big. It may be that you are doing something for the first time. It might be a court application. It might be that you're taking the lead with a particular client. It may be that you're out there applying for a new job. It may come up in relation to something that means a lot to you. I don't know if you've noticed, I noticed for myself, I feel a lot less fearful in relation to challenges or tasks where I have less of an emotional investment. So maybe the fear is coming up in relation to something that holds a lot of meaning in your work or in your personal life. It may be that you are about to have a difficult conversation. I know I have this fear sometimes when I'm about to go in for a conversation with somebody where I'm putting myself at risk. There's some element of vulnerability, or I'm asking for something and I don't feel 100% comfortable about it. And it's almost like you're stepping off the diving board and just diving in and initiating a conversation, not knowing how that other person is going to respond, but you know you need to do it. Another example might be when you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position. So again, this kind of goes back to this idea of putting yourself out there for the first time, stretching yourself. You don't know if you're going to be able to do the thing because you haven't done it yet. It's that conversation. It's maybe putting your name forward for a job interview. It's maybe reaching out to somebody new in a networking situation. Those are situations where you might start to feel some fear. What we're not talking about today is the fear that you feel when your physical health is in jeopardy. For example, if you're about to cross the street and a car whizzes by and you have that immediate fear reaction, or you nearly fall down the stairs, or you're sitting in your office and somebody opens the door really quickly and you startle. That's not really the type of fear that we're talking about. Although at a physiological level, the fear that you experience really feels the same, regardless of whether it's a fear because you're going to fall down the stairs, or in my case, jump off your bungee platform in Mexico, or if the fear is something different, like the email that comes in from a client where you are anticipating it's going to be a challenging conversation, or the fear comes in from opposing counsel and you are worried about what they're going to say about your brief. And when we talk about fear, I also think it's important to acknowledge what is happening within your body, and it puts your body in that fight or flight response. And I talk about it in earlier episodes. And one way I like to describe this is it puts you into that reactive state as opposed to the more creative state. And I love those two contrasts because it's the same letters, but spelling and meaning two completely different things. So when you are in that fearful state, then you are coming from a different energy. You are dealing with things in a more reactive way, and it sort of deprives you of that ability to think at a different level. But fear, as much as it may hold us back, is ultimately serving a purpose. It's an evolutionary advantage because it allows us to survive. It's your body's hardwired mechanism for survival. And if you can imagine, if you've ever had small children running around and you see them running around a playground, for example, I remember I was very grateful that my children had fear instincts so that they weren't throwing themselves off the edge of the playground. And sometimes I wondered. So when it comes to fear, it does serve a purpose, but sometimes it can become a problem. And when exactly does it become a problem? Well, it is just a feeling. So fear on its own probably isn't going to do a ton of harm to you. And there's research out there that really supports the idea that fear can be of benefit to you. And there was a course that I took earlier this year offered by Daniel Amen's clinic. He's an American psychiatrist and a brain disorder specialist, and he offered a brain health coaching course, which I will talk about in future episodes. I think some of the learning there was fascinating. One of the points that he made in his course was that humans with we kind of talked about this spectrum of anxiety, and for those who have no anxiety at all, they are actually at greater risk of death than people who have more anxiety, a healthy level of anxiety, because that anxiety is what compels people to look both ways before they cross the street and other activities that actually maintain health. So the idea isn't to have no fear. The idea is to have a healthy level of fear and to have tools to manage it properly. Now, when does fear become a problem then? Well, here are some examples of where fear can become a problem. Number one is fear can become a problem when you allow fear to talk yourself out of doing the things that will help you move forward. So I would invite you to think about what is going on in your practice right now and to think about where you may not be doing something, where you may not be taking a certain step because of fear. So it may be that you would like to ask for help on a certain project, but you're fearful that if you ask, then the person you're asking will think that you're not capable of doing that project. Maybe you're afraid of saying no to something. Maybe somebody has asked you for assistance on a file or a project or some other activity, and it may not be something that's fully within your bandwidth. It may be something that you just don't have capacity for right now, but you're afraid that if you say no, you're going to somehow damage that relationship. Maybe another way that fear is showing up is that you are not speaking up. And I remember when I was practicing, I really had a lot of fear around public speaking, and I still have some fear. I try to mitigate that fear because I need to do it. I want to do it. But I remember being very shy, especially as a young lawyer, and not speaking up. And I think of the opportunities that I missed out on. And I see that in others as well, where they are talking themselves out of opportunities because of fear. Another place where a lack of action might create some serious consequences is where there's fear around making a decision. So you may be sitting in a position where you want to move forward and it requires making a decision, and you keep on going back and forth, weighing the pros and cons, but you're not taking any action toward that decision. And as you delay making the decision, you're not making any progress. Another place where fear can be a problem is where it slows you down. So maybe you are not in the state of inaction, but you really aren't moving forward very quickly. And in this case, you might ask yourself, how much time are you spending weighing a decision or taking action, but taking it very slowly? Sometimes it really shows up with decision making. So again, thinking about, and I would invite you to think about what decision you might have on your plate right now that you're not making. And what is it costing you to not make that decision? Chances are, if you're stuck with a decision, it's based out of a fear that you're going to make the wrong decision. It's almost like you want to be able to say, if I make decision Y, then all these things will flow from that, and that must be the right decision. Or I want to decide X, because I know if I do X, then all these other things will flow from it. And the reality is, when you're at that point in time and you're making the decision, you have no way of knowing exactly what is going to unfold from that. And if that unknowing is slowing you down from making the decision and moving forward, it is costing you. And I totally understand it. I mean, if you're in a legal practice, for example, and you're making a decision that affects an outcome for a client, for example, there may be a decision that truly is a correct decision. I mean, there may be some technical guideline. There's something that you absolutely must do, that there is truly a right and a wrong decision. But for many decisions, especially in a legal practice, you're operating in a shade of gray. And it may be that there is no right decision or no wrong decision. Same goes for decisions that you're making within your practice for your own growth, your own development. It may be that there's no right decision or wrong decision, that there are choices to be made, but with each choice that you make, you could find a viable path. So for example, maybe a decision that you're trying to make is, do I go out on my own as a sole practitioner, or do I stay in the organization that I'm in and work my way forward? And it may be that there's no right or wrong decision. They're just different decisions. And you need to make a decision one way or the other so that you can move forward and stop spending your mental energy thinking about what option would be better for you. Fear is also a problem when you allow it to make yourself miserable. And you might think about how much time you might spend ruminating or perseverating over something that you fear might happen. And there's that expression. I think it's something like 99% of the things that you worry about resolve themselves on their own. But think about all that time that you're spending thinking about something, worrying about something, being fearful of something that may or may not even happen. And again, let's think about what that is costing you. And it's not just the time that you're spending stewing in your thoughts. It's also using your precious time to make yourself miserable thinking about it. And one way I just thought of thinking about that time is, imagine if you had your time docket and you had to account for that time that you're spending in fear over something that may or may not happen. I mean, what would that look like on your timesheet? 0.25 time spent ruminating over something that may or may not happen. And I say this and try to make light of this, but I have absolutely done this myself, the ruminating, not the recording part. And it's just important, I think, to keep in mind that the time that you're spending making yourself miserable isn't serving anybody. It's certainly not serving you. It's not serving your clients. It's just having an impact on your mental well-being. The next way that fear is potentially a problem is when you fear fear itself. And the image that I think of here is when you're watching one of those horror films. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, I don't know if you ever have watched horror films. I don't really watch them anymore, but as a younger person, I used to really enjoy a good thriller. And what was always fascinating to me was that most of these horror films would involve some sort of a chase scene, right? Where the big scary monster is chasing after its would-be victim. And the chase itself can go on. Maybe it starts out with like this slow process where you as the spectator can see this relationship forming or the problem about to set itself up. And as you continue, that escalates into a chasing scene and ends in, the big scary monster, I don't know, eating up the victim, whatever it is. And what's so fascinating, if you think about that, is that in the build up to the actual climax of the scene, it is so nerve-wracking, right? There's all this fear that builds up and you're sitting on the edge of the seat. But when the big scary monster finally reaches its victims and everything is done and said and over, there's no fear left. And the reason that I say this is, and the reason that I mention this is that sometimes you get to that point where you think something is truly fearful, you're scared of it, but you finally get to that moment. And when you're in it, you realize it's tough, maybe it's uncomfortable, but it's not nearly as scary as it was in your mind. And as a lawyer, you've got this brilliant brain and a creative imagination. And I can assure you that the fantasies of what all horrible things could possibly happen to you are going to happen are far worse than what could actually happen. And so I invite you to think about the fear of the fear and what that is costing you and what it would be like if you could not go through that process or at least manage it better. So we all have reached a certain level of proficiency. You have reached a certain level of professional success. You may have some amazing tools for dealing with fear. I know that there are some strategies that some individuals have tried that maybe haven't been as effective. So for example, maybe you are really, really good at addressing fear in certain areas of your life, but not in others. So for example, you may be excellent at confronting your fears in a litigation context of appearing very strong and making your points and feeling confident. But when it comes to having a difficult conversation in your personal life, you really feel the fear and you are unable to put yourself in that vulnerable position where you need to ask for something, where you need to express your needs. Maybe you simply avoid situations where you would feel fear. Maybe you're afraid of going to court, and so you simply design a practice around not going. And maybe that's exactly what you need. Maybe that's the right decision for you. But maybe there's a part of you that really wants to go to court, and you're not allowing yourself to explore that because of the fear. Maybe you're avoiding networking. Maybe you're avoiding saying no. Maybe you're avoiding taking risks. And it may be also that you are muddling your way through fear by forcing yourself. Maybe you can really bring yourself to do the steps, but the whole way through, you're really doubting yourself. Maybe you see fear as a problem. It's a sign that you're not good enough, that you're not cut out for the job that you're doing. And maybe you say things to yourself like, if I was the right person for this job, I wouldn't be feeling so scared. So these are all strategies that you might be using that can get you a certain distance in the short run, but that aren't necessarily going to serve you in the long run. When you see fear itself as something that is really threatening, you deprive yourself of the opportunity to use that fear for growth. And I would argue, and I think the research supports this, that we're all hardwired for growth. This weekend, I was walking in my neighborhood. It's late spring where I live, and there were a number of rose bushes out, and they're kind of at the end stage of the blooming season. But I was thinking about it, and the roses come back every year. They're hardwired to do it. All of these plants around us, the trees, the leaves, the seasons, etc. It's all a cycle, and we are all hardwired to grow. You don't see a rose bush saying, "Hey, I'm taking this season off. Thank you very much." It isn't. It's in all of us to want to continue to grow and to thrive. And so as long as we're alive, as long as we're practicing, and it goes back to the notion that I talked about in episode 3 about creating a joyful practice, this idea of growth is something, this continued learning, that is something that motivates all of us. Each of us has tried to resolve our fears in different ways, but unfortunately, these strategies don't necessarily work in the long run. When we see fear as something that is threatening, we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to grow. And for each of us, that desire to grow is really hardwired into us. And if you go back to episode number 3, I talk about a joyful practice and how the practice itself is in the learning and in the growing and reaching toward our potential. And if we avoid things that cause us to feel fearful, we're not truly growing. So when we let fear run the show, we end up not creating what it is that we want. And there are a few reasons for that. Number one is stagnation. When we avoid situations where we feel fear, we're not going to grow. We're not going to learn. We're not going to test. We're not going to make mistakes and learn from those. We're simply going to stagnate. And I talked about this in episode 4 in relation to perfectionism. Sometimes we'll put off doing something or we will not do something because we're afraid that it's not going to be perfect. And the result is that we don't create something that is perfect because we haven't given ourselves the opportunity to even try doing it. And what ends up is this self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you're fearful of doing a certain thing, maybe it's the trip to court, maybe it's public speaking, maybe it's networking, then you never develop your skills in that area. So it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy where you simply do not grow in that area. And if this is something that you can relate to, then I would ask you to ask yourself, what dreams are you letting drift because you're afraid of what might happen? Another thing that's created if you're not dealing with the fears head on is that you may be creating negative outcomes. So you can imagine, and I know I had files like this, those files that are on your desk that you haven't really touched for a while. And sometimes it may not be fear, it's maybe some other reason, but at a certain point, it may become fear. Like, ooh, what happens if I look at that file? Like, really, what's inside of it? And the longer you leave that file, the more stale it starts to get, the more prickly it starts to feel, and it sits there. And it continues to sit there. And then at some point, it goes from being this thing that maybe you were afraid of, maybe there was something in there that was challenging for you, to this ticking time bomb. And what was once something that was unpleasant, that caused a little bit of fear, turns into a full-blown fire hazard. So if this is happening to you, I would invite you to think about where else this is showing up. Is it showing up in your relationships? Maybe it's a conversation that you're putting off that would be really beneficial for you to have. Maybe it's your health. Maybe you are turning a blind eye to it. You're just trying to get through the next month. But meanwhile, you're letting your health take a bit of a beating. And there's something that you could start doing about it if you allowed yourself to simply turn your focus to it. And probably the biggest cost of not really managing your fear is really that you may be living small. And there are consequences to that, not just for yourself, but also for those who would really benefit from seeing you live out your potential. And there's a wonderful quote by a woman named Marianne Williamson. She's an American author. She wrote a book called Return to Love, Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles. And there's a quote in that book where she talks about fear. And I'm going to read that to you, and I'd really invite you to think about what this means to you. So it goes, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? And I pause here to invite you to ask yourself, how many times have you been thinking about taking something on that just seems bigger than yourself, and you've talked yourself out of it by saying something like that? Who am I to do X? Who am I to take on that file? Who am I to be doing this work? Really think about that. Going back to the quote, actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. And I pause here again. If it's not God for you, it may be some other power, but think about what that means for you. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. as we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. So the reason that I love this quote, there are two main reasons. Number one is that the idea here is that we have it all within us to do great things, and we ought not let fear hold us back from doing those things. And the second thing that I love about this quote is that it's not just about us and us accomplishing our own goals and doing our work in the world. It's about being an example for other people so that they then feel the confidence, or they feel inspired, or they see you and they say, well, she was brave enough to go and do this thing. I'm going to be brave enough and try to do the thing that I'm truly wanting to do. So in relation to that quote, and if you're thinking about that, ask yourself, what dream of yours are you not fully going after because you're scared to make the call? And what is that costing? Not just you, but the opportunity for you to be inspirational for others who are around you. So there are better ways to do fear, and I'm going to jump into that now. That's really the focus of today's episode. And the reason that these tools are going to help you is that they go to the issue itself. They tackle the question of the fear itself. And when you learn to drop the fear of the fear, your world can really open up. You no longer hold yourself back. You no longer have to work so hard to push your way through a difficult situation. And let's talk about those 5 tools starting now. The first tool is to examine your thinking behind the fear. When you have that fear come up, maybe it's a full-scale fear, it's a big project you're about to launch and you're feeling really nervous about it. Or maybe it's a smaller fear. Maybe it's something that just kind of comes as almost like a hiccup in your day. I'd invite you to pause and to think about what is going on behind that fear. So write down and describe what the fear is. I would invite you to get pretty specific about it. What is it that you're afraid of? Are you afraid of judgment? Are you afraid of embarrassing yourself? Are you afraid of letting somebody else down? Are you afraid that you're going to ruin a relationship? Are you afraid that you're going to fail to meet expectations? Are you afraid of failure? Really getting specific about what that fear is can be really helpful for you for a couple of reasons. Number one, it allows you to get that fear out of your head and onto paper. And when you can see that fear written down on paper, it's freeing. It allows you to have that observer perspective. And, you might look at it and think, well, it's a lot less fearful or intimidating than I thought it was. And depending on what the fear is, you might even look at it when it's written down on paper and realize that the fear itself is ridiculous. So the second benefit of writing the fear down is that it allows you to examine it more closely. Really ask yourself, what is it that is behind the fear? What is the bigger implication here? And what is really fascinating about that is that often with something that we fear, and I alluded to this earlier, the reason that we feel fear around it is because it's something that really matters to us. And if you can uncover what that thing is by doing this exercise, then you can understand what is significant to you and use that to help you move forward. The second tool that I would suggest is to focus on the big picture. When you start examining this fear more closely, you might ask yourself where it fits in relation to your broader goals. What is important to you about the thing that you're about to do? So in my case, for example, I was looking at the podcast, and to me, this is a way of reaching you. This is a way of reaching you and other women lawyers who I want to connect with, who I want to support, who I want to offer tools to. And when I look at it that way, then I can see how it fits within the greater context of the work that I'm doing. And when it comes to your example, I would invite you to think about what is the significance of the step that you're about to take? Maybe you're going to be speaking at a conference, and the reason is that you're trying to help develop your relationships with a particular group of people. You want to help inform them about some information that would be really useful to them, and that all of this is part of a practice that you're building where what you're trying to do is create some significant impact. Maybe it's a significant change in a certain practice area. So I'd really invite you to look at that big picture and to think about how this particular event fits in with that larger picture. This is really helpful for taking the focus off of yourself. When we're thinking about ourselves and we're thinking about the fear that we're feeling, we're not really focused on the person that we're trying to serve. So let's turn that around and look at them and think about, how can I help in this situation? How is this work that I'm doing going to potentially have an impact on somebody else? How is it that I can show up in service to that other person? And why is this work, why is this thing that I'm doing important to others? And I promise you that when you start to think about the work that you're doing in relation to others, when you start to think about it as being in service, when the focus is taken off of you and how you feel about the fear that you're feeling, it opens up a whole new way of looking at it, where it no longer is about you. It's no longer about the fear. You are now involved in a project, an exercise. You're doing something and you're creating in a way that is in service to others, that is well beyond yourself. And that itself is really empowering when it comes to overcoming the fear that is trying to hold you back. Another helpful way of using the big picture to help you overcome your fear is to imagine yourself at a point in the future where you've accomplished that thing, the greater objective that you have ahead of you. And if you imagine yourself at that point in time, think about what you would be telling yourself at this particular point in time, right? So you imagine you're there, you've already accomplished it. What would you be saying to yourself? What would you be saying about the steps that you had to take to get there? Number 3 is to adopt a growth mindset around fear. I spoke earlier about Carol Dweck and the research that she's done and her book, Mindset, where she talks about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And at a very, high level, the growth mindset is where you believe that through hard work, through exertion, through effort, you're able to become smarter, you're able to increase your capacity and your skills, versus a fixed mindset where you believe that you are who you are, your talents are fixed, and effort is a sign that you're not good enough, not smart enough, and so you tend to shy away from difficult projects. Here, if you can start to take a growth mindset approach to fear, you can see fear as a signal that you're absolutely on the right path. That if something is creating fear for you, that it means that there is growth here. And it means that what you're about to do truly matters, and that if you move through it, you are going to grow, you are going to accomplish something that is meaningful to you. And here I would invite you to accept the idea that fear is a stepping stone to any big dream that you may have where you're going to be moving out of your comfort zone. Again, nobody really talks about fear. It's not listed on any particular SMART goal. Fear is something that comes up in the moment, and I'm here to tell you it's not a signal that you're doing it wrong or that there's something wrong with you. And if you look at it in the language of the growth mindset, it's a sign that you are growing. It's a sign that you're learning. Number 4 is to take one small step. It's like riding a bicycle. Once you get pedaling, momentum builds and you become more confident, you have your balance, and you're off to the races. But that first step, that first bit is the hardest. In my case, when I was sitting there frozen last week, I was able to convince myself to do one thing. It was a post on LinkedIn. And I thought, I'll do this post today, and then I will do the rest tomorrow. And that turned out to be a good strategy because I was able to do more steps the following day. And I will continue to take steps in that direction. But it was just that initial thing, right? Just find one small thing that you can do, and that will help you move forward. And from there, you can start to build your momentum. So think about that. Think about the projects that are on your desk, for example, or that are no longer on your desk. You've filed them away in a cabinet. What is one thing you can do? For some people, that's making a phone call to somebody about a project or a course or something that they're interested in pursuing. It's just that phone call. You don't need to be fully ready. It doesn't have to be a perfect conversation. The key here is just to build some starting momentum so that you are slowly but definitely moving toward your goal. And finally, number 5, have somebody that you can talk to. Now, in my case, I retained a coach. I love working with my coach. She's amazing. And I knew that I wanted to see this project through. I knew that I would have a hard time carving out the time that I needed to make this project happen, I knew that I would have resistance. And so I brought somebody in that I thought would be able to help me. And it has been very helpful just for accountability, for talking through some of the decisions that I've had to make along the way. And for you, it may be a coach, but it doesn't have to be a coach. I would simply invite you to choose somebody, or maybe it's more than one person, who you can talk to about the fact that you're feeling fear about whatever it is that you're trying to do. It could be a friend. It could be a trusted colleague. It could be a family member. It could be your dog. The key here is to find somebody who will support you. You can kind of go friend shopping, and you know that there are some people who are going to support you in what you're doing and encourage you and tell you it's a great idea. And you know that there are others who might try to talk you out of it because they might be fearful as well. So try to be selective in terms of who you choose to support you. And when you do find somebody, I would add one caveat to that, which would be to not let the conversations that you have with that person take you away from actually executing on your work. So, for example, when I was going through my own sort of drama on last week, I did think, wouldn't it be nice to call so-and-so and vent a little bit about this project, and not in a negative way, but just in a way to express, I'm nervous about this. But when I thought about that, ultimately I decided, well, that's not really going to move anybody forward. It's not really probably going to move them forward. It's certainly not going to move them forward. I didn't really see it moving myself forward. And so I decided against it. So I would just invite you to be mindful of that. Is the conversation that you're having moving you forward, or are you using that conversation as a way of further putting off the work that you want to be doing? So those are the 5 tips. And thank you for staying with me. I only have a couple more things to say, and I realize this podcast is getting much longer than I had anticipated. But I think this is a really important topic. And so I do hope that you are finding benefit in going through this with me. What you will find is when you start to allow fear, you will grow, and you will still feel fear. I think some of us like to believe, before I became a coach, I used to think, well, maybe when I'm a coach, I'll no longer feel fear. The truth is, I still feel it. Obviously, I've just been talking about it, but you can learn new tools, new strategies to move through it. And over time, as you continue to move through fear, you'll build up what is effectively a muscle, and you'll be able to move through the fear more easily, and you'll create more of what you want. So I would invite you to think about what dreams you have for your practice, what big goals you've been thinking about, and ask yourself whether fear is holding you back. And if so, that's actually kind of a good thing, because this may be your opportunity to start digging into that fear. And you can use the tools that we talked about today. Number 1, examining that fear, putting it on paper so that you can take a closer look at it. Number 2, ask yourself where this thing that is causing the fear fits into the bigger picture. Why must you do it? Number 3, adopt a growth mindset. So stop beating yourself up over the fact that you feel fear and start asking yourself what growth can come from this experience. Number 4, take one small step, just one small step. And from that place, you can build. Number 5, find somebody who can support you. So that, my friends, is what I've got for you today. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for being with me during this podcast. If this podcast episode, if the podcasts that you listen to resonate with you and you like them, I would love to have your support in helping me to share this podcast with others. I've been told that by rating the podcast, I think a 5-star rating is ideal. If you love the podcast, then please invite you to do that. It would be great. I'd appreciate it. And with that, I will be signing off. I'm excited to reconnect with you next week. In today's episode, we talked about fear. Last week, we talked about perfectionism. These are both things that can really hold you back. Next week, we're going to be talking about a very simple goal-setting framework. It's very simple. I use it myself. I teach it to clients, and it is a tool that can help you to overcome both of those things. So please join me next week. I'm excited to share it with you so that you can use it to create exactly what you want in your practice. Thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful week. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.